We're on.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the Christmas issue of Practico's Costs Chat Between Friends, which is our replacement for the breakfast meetings that we used to have before COVID. The friends on this particular occasion, we're very pleased to welcome Andrew Gordon-Saker, the Senior Cost Judge, who's very kindly agreed to join us and take time from his very, very busy schedule. Andy Ellis, Managing Director of Practico, and me, Jeremy Morgan, retired cost barrister and consultant to Practico. We called it a cost chat between friends, and we hope that the Senior Cost Judge will not regard this as compromising his undoubted impartiality on all matters that come before him. A quick preview of what we're going to talk about. It's partly a Christmas issue and partly because not a huge amount of really important developments have taken place in cost law just recently. So what we're going to do is have a look at how the Cost Office has managed to run things during the period of various greater and lesser lockdowns, with an input also from Andy on how things are seen from that side of the fence. Something about Guideline Hourly Rates, which have been one or two developments, and discussion of whether there's been any progress on other matters such as fixed costs and DBAs. But I'd like to kick off then straight away with asking the Senior Cost Judge for a very personal view, I'm sure it will be, of how it's been over the last year or so running the Cost Office and how the Cost Office has managed to cope and what changes have had to take place to deal with the various problems that have been.
Well, like everybody else, the first lockdown, although we were expecting it for a relatively short period before it started, came as something of a surprise. So like most people for the first week or two, we were trying to work out how we were going to do things and what we were going to do. And we had a significant advantage in that we had recently introduced electronic filing. It had become compulsory in January and has been voluntary from the summer of last year. So pretty much most of the hearings that we had from April onwards were derived from electronic files. And that is a huge benefit, because if you're, for example, a judge in the county court or in a district registry of the High Court, which doesn't have electronic files, somehow the court staff have to get the paper file to you for each case that you hear. But with electronic files, we can access any file from anywhere on pretty much any electronic device. So that was sort of a third of the equation. There seems to be sort of three aspects we had to get to grips with. One was files, which we had the benefit of electronic filing. The other was the sort of IT technology, and the third was getting the solicitors' papers. The IT equipment has improved significantly, or at least the IT capabilities have improved significantly over the last 8 months. The court service IT department really did step up. Few of us had much experience of video hearings before March and April. So I'd had the odd case where I either had one party, usually because they were in prison, by video, and sometimes a witness giving evidence by video. But my experience of that was generally absolutely awful. I mean, with the prisoners, who were generally paying bills because SCCO or Group 4 or whoever had decided that they were going to enforce costs orders to discourage proceedings, were obviously spread around the country, and you either heard them and didn't see them, or you saw them and didn't hear them. So the court IT equipment for video hearings was awful, and we had Skype and Teams on our computers, but I don't think many people use them. So there was a lot of sort of on the hoof training, very urgently given to us, and an awful lot of help given in the form of written guides, which were produced at very short notice. And over time, we moved from Skype, which probably wasn't so good, to Teams. And I think nowadays most people use Teams. So that the having the hearing in terms of the IT has got a lot better.
The judiciary has always been very reluctant to deal with IT, so we hear. Do you think they've improved as a result of really having to do it?
Well, I think absolutely. I mean, we have to do. I think every judge now uses video hearings. I mean, when I started as a full-time cross judge 17 years ago, we all had laptops, but I inherited my laptop from the person I inherited my room from, and he obviously never switched it on. And then most of them actually hadn't switched them on, and a few of them hadn't even taken them out of the box. And to send an email to somebody, you had to unplug your phone and plug in your laptop, and sort of, you've got the clicking and the whirring. And so a good half an hour just to send an email or to receive an email. So, I mean, all that has gone. Everybody, I mean, even some of my deputy colleagues who I love dearly, but who aren't, they're retired costs judges who probably weren't the most keen on IT. I mean, they have embraced it with enthusiasm, because the reality is we either do this or we do nothing. This is the only way of having hearings. The Thomas More building physically, it just doesn't enable social distancing. You can't pass somebody in the corridor because the corridors are too narrow. You can't get more than 3 or 4 people in a room, and you've got to shepherd them in and shepherd them out. And there are limited lifts, and any one person can go in a lift at a time. So it's hopeless. So, I mean, there have been very few in-person hearings, as we now call them. I think a handful. They're held in the courts in the main building, or have been held in the courts in the main building. And generally that's because somebody's got to give evidence orally, and a view is taken that for whatever reason that can't be done by video. So yeah, we've had to do it, because if we didn't do it, we wouldn't be able to do anything. And so even the most die-hard technophobes, not that there are such things, of course, amongst the cost have embraced and actually got quite keen on video hearings, and they work a lot better than they probably did at the beginning. We're getting more used to them. We understand how they work better, I think, and we have better systems better understanding of what's needed, and better systems for running the hearings. And then the third aspect that we needed to get to grips with is getting the receiving parties' solicitors' files, because again, our history of electronic files hasn't been great, largely because our equipment wasn't great. So if somebody gave us a memory stick with all their files on, that would cause our laptops to seize up, or same with the CD-ROM. So we've got new laptops, we've got better monitors, we've got the kit, and we now have the ability, I think, to receive larger files. That the court service set up something called the Document Upload Center, which will receive files of any size. You can send your files to the DUC, as it's called, knowing that they're going to be held securely, and they're only going to be accessible by my clerk and me. There's also, I think, now a greater willingness to access file sharing sites. So the last hearing I've had, for example, I've been accessing 3 file sharing sites. It sounds a bit clunky, because you've got to move from one to the other, and sometimes you get kicked out and you've got to re-enter your password. But actually, if the alternative is files of papers, somebody's got to go through the files looking for that attendance note that they need to find, or that letter, or whatever. And it's no slower, even if you do get kicked out, and even if you've forgotten your password and have to look it up. So it's the 3 components have come together, and I think that's going to have an effect for the long term, because while it's better to have physical hearings, I think probably what we're going to get out of this, once the present pandemic is over, it is a greater use of video hearings or greater use of video for shorter hearings, rather than dragging people across the country for a half-hour criminal appeal or an hour application or something. And greater use of electronic files, just to avoid, and partly to avoid having to deal with large boxes of documents or large quantities of documents. But also for those solicitors who have worked electronically, some for years, it is crazy that, by reason of our lack of technology, we've required them to print off hundreds of thousands of emails, stick them all in files, and then lodge them at the costs office with a detailed assessment hearing. So, I mean, we've got the equipment. I think we've got the skills, and we now have the enthusiasm to deal with cases where the papers are electronically.
It's hard to talk of a silver lining for something like COVID, but it sounds as though it has been a stimulus to the court system, whose IT has not always been the best, to really invest and move into the 21st century, I suppose.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, obviously, the expenditure that's been incurred on this will inevitably lead to those in charge of the court service saying, well, we now need a return on this. So, I mean, I hope that doesn't mean that video hearings become the norm. I think most of us would rather have in-person hearings. But I think there is, probably even before the pandemic, that there was an enthusiasm for moving things online. And I suspect that will probably be strengthened by the fact we now actually, because of the pandemic, have better equipment and we're better skills and more enthusiasm. So I think
as a consumer, Andy, sorry. So as a consumer, Andy, what's your experience of the same few months been?
Well, I think you summed it up very well, which is that I think we're probably rightly, respectful of keeping away from saying, there's been some good things to come out of COVID, because there haven't been any good things to come out of COVID. But it must be the case that, at a rough guess, the acceleration of the move towards remote hearings and certainly the use of electronic documents, it's hard to put a figure on it, because I think without any form of compulsion, we could have been, we would have been talking about at least a parallel system for, 5 years or more. But, it's quite possible that that we might have moved forward, 10 years in a year, in terms of how things have worked. And I think, as Andrew just said, if we can keep the good bits and reintroduce elements of person to person, I mean, certainly, perhaps it's just getting used to it, but I find that the hearings work much better than I expected to on video, but they're also quite draining in a way somehow that person to person hearings, in-person hearings aren't. And even though I'm not nostalgic to get back on the tube again anytime soon, because there's faff involved with getting there, and as you say, it's sort of the risks involved with using the lifts at the Thomas More building are not necessarily COVID related. There's some that are all that belong to just that whole lift system. But certainly what's accelerated for us is, and certainly for me, is that I was pretty rubbish at using PDF technology. And I'm still GCSE, not anything more than that. But certainly, having been forced down the line of looking at Acrobat DC Pro, or whatever they call it these days, and what you're able to do with it in terms of annotating, combining, paginating, forming bundles, so on and so forth, it is much better. And I think we are, as a firm, we are genuinely paperless now, in a way that we were 1 foot in and 1 foot out before, and that's got to be a good thing.
Anything else, Andrew? Let's say Andrew Gordon-Saker, about this year's experience.
No, I mean, I think I mean, I would like to mention the court staff who have done a tremendous job in keeping us going, and I'm not just saying that, they really have. The SCCO staff actually won the regional court service award for coping through the pandemic. It actually, I mean, no disrespect to them, but the award looks like a piece of broken window, but that's, you know, it's a piece of modern art. But I don't think that means anything. But they have done really well. I mean, we're the only public counter, I think, in the RCJ that kept open the whole time. So some of them have been in every day since the first lockdown to receive bundles and put bits of paper in files where we still have paper files, and keeping us going. I mean, in terms of, I just add one thing about video hearings. I mean, Andy's right that they are more draining, and I'm not quite sure why that is. Maybe just staring at screens all day has an effect, or maybe because they're possibly a little bit more concentrated. And for from my perspective, and probably I suspect from the perspective of other of the professionals, that you know, there's a lot more organising to do for them. You've got to make sure that everybody's had the right invites to the right hearing, and afterwards I've got to sort of sort out recordings and things. So they add a degree of admin which certainly the judges didn't have before. And I mean, my practice, and I don't think this is universal, and I'm sure there are better ways of doing it, is to take 2 half-hour breaks, so one in the middle of the morning and one in the middle of the afternoon, which reduces the length of the hearing by an hour, so 20% on a 5-hour day, because most of the people are appearing from home. I mean, some people are appearing from offices, unless they have very odd homes. You know, they've got all the problems of being at home. They've got people banging on the door, or they've got kids, or they've got the dog barking and that sort of thing. And they need to know that they will get a break at 11:30, and they will get a break at 3 o'clock, so they can sort out the kids, and they can pick their shopping up off the front doorstep. that they can, you know, sort out whatever they need to do. So my practice has been to sort of tell them at the beginning, we take a break at 11:30, we take a break at 3 for half an hour. And half an hour sounds generous, but by the time you've been to the loo and made coffee and brought the shopping in, or sorted out the kids, or fed the dog, or whatever else, it quickly disappears. And I have offered, I think in every case, to add on an hour at the end. So if you want, I'll sit from 5 to 6. Yeah. In every case, they've refused it. So no, they don't want to do that. And if you've got,
it reminds me of an earlier cost judge, Master Pollard, who used to also have a break in the middle of the morning, in the middle of the afternoon. But the reason became apparent when he came back into his room after the break. There's a small amount of pipe smoke emerging from his top drawer.
Yeah, exactly. I used to try and seek to curry favour with him by suggesting that there was something that I needed to get instructions on, or is there something that he might like to read halfway through the morning, as he was getting a bit twitchier on the top of his desk. And it didn't do me any good at all. He was very, very nice about it. He seemed to appreciate it, but he still used to take pleasure in rejecting most of my submissions. So.
I inherited his room and his desk, and the top right-hand drawer, literally, there was no base to it. It had burned away from putting his pipe in there while it was still lit.
Moving on, perhaps then to, that was a really interesting insight into how it's been from that side of the bench. Little bit of discussion about guideline hourly rates. So obviously, been quite a big issue this year. Anything new going on there?
Well, the Civil Justice Council Working Group is soon, I think, to produce a draft report for consultation. The timetable, I think, is that it should be produced before Christmas. Obviously, we'd only just got started in March, and we'd had one meeting before the first lockdown, so things were delayed for a few months. The draft report should be going out for consultation, I think, around about Christmas. There'll then be consultation over the first part of the new year. And we're hoping to produce it in around about June, I think, so in its final form. And without giving any secrets away, I think we've got enough data to produce a set of figures which hopefully will pass muster with the master of the rolls. It's I think it's looking quite positive. And we've had 10 years without guideline hourly rates. Lord Dyson, when he was master of the rolls, and took the decision that the 2010 rates would continue for the foreseeable future, anticipated changes in costs which haven't happened. So he thought that fixed costs would be extended to a much greater extent than they have been. In fact, since 2014, 2015, when he made that decision, there have been no new fixed costs regimes introduced, although we still have recommendations, obviously, from Rupert Jackson's review in 2017. They haven't yet been implemented. So that hasn't happened. The new test of proportionality, I don't think, has had the effect which people thought it would. So that hasn't, I think, had much of an impact on hourly rates. Solicitors still charge by hourly rates. It's very rare that I see a case where they've agreed a fixed sum for the job. So I think we still need hourly rates, or we still need guideline hourly rates. And I mean, the options really were to have a serious go at coming up with some new ones, which is what we've done, or just to say, forget the guidelines. To some extent, there's no point in referring to 10-year-old rates, because they're 10-year-old rates, and you can say, well, it's appropriate to use 10-year-old rates and uprate them for inflation, but everybody's going to take a different measure of inflation or different period over which the inflation runs. Which just makes the whole thing a bit pointless. So yes, I think spurred on by Mrs. Justice O'Farrell in the open case, we've got on with it, and as I say, I think we'll produce figures which I won't say people are happy with, but which hopefully will pass muster with the new master of the rolls.
Without
I heard the magic names. Sorry. Andy, I had the magic names Fenn and Rickman mentioned in this context. I hear they're still at it. It must be 10 years.
They are. They've been really helpful on this, as they have been on others. But yes, they're the go-to guys for anything to do with costs, and they're still the go-to guys. And long may their involvement continue, because they are very useful. And you don't have to explain everything. If you took an economist who has no experience of costs or the law and said, well, this is the problem, it would probably take a long time to explain what the problem was in terms that they understand. But Paul Fenn and Neil Rickman just say, yes, fine, we understand, because we did this then and we did this then, and it's just to some extent a continuation of that.
I interrupted you, Andy.
Oh, I was only going to ask a question, not asking for you to give anything away at all, but I just wondered whether there would be a need to backfill a little bit for previous years, because if you just end up with new guideline rates as of now, or whenever they're produced, that's fantastic. But you could well be seeing cases that have taken place over 3 to 4 years beforehand. It's still in a sort of lacuna for rates. So I'm just wondering if I can see some idea of where somebody will try and index them backwards a little bit if they're current, or whether there might be a sort of an attempt at saying, well, for certain years it would be this, and that's how it's progressed over the last 5 years, say. Well,
coming up with one set of rates, I'll tell you, has been quite a job. Coming up with 10 sets of rates, I think, would just be beyond us. So no, I mean, obviously somebody could work out if the grade A rate for the city is now going to be this, and it was that then you can obviously work out how you get from one to the other at any particular point in time. So yeah, I mean it's possible, but no, the short answer is we're not planning on a back catalogue of
no
rates you have missed over the last 10 years.
Exactly. And please, that wasn't a request, by the way. I don't want to get into your bad books.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I've got the skills to edit it out of this video, but I won't take it any further.
I mean, the next thing is going to be, looking to the future, and the future will be different. There are going to be different ways of working. So we haven't really taken that into account because we don't know what's going to happen. But if people are working from home more, if firms do abandon city centres, it will change the dynamics of hourly rates. But that's going to be, we can't do anything about it now because we don't know what's going to happen. But that's probably going to be for the next review, and that may be a bigger piece of work, I think.
Or over several years. I mean, I think it certainly makes me think that there'll be lots of new type of arguments along the lines of the Wraith and Sheffield Forgemasters or what have you. In terms of well, perhaps I'd summarise it by saying perhaps there'd be a slight recalibration so that geography is not as big a determinant in the rates perhaps as it is now. Not a question for now, but I think that could be a theme that develops over the next few years if the direction of travel, or rather lack of it, is it continues the way we expect it to. Dispersed firms. I mean, I know of some clients of ours who had already taken the plunge of not moving out from London, but perhaps moving to smaller offices that are based on 65-70% capacity as opposed to 100 to reflect more flexible working, that will probably now find that that's probably twice as much as they need. Now they've still got the financial commitment for it, and the larger the firm, normally the longer the lease agreements are. But certainly, in terms of how we live in the future, it seems that we might all end up in some form of serviced office or hub of some sort or other, which where we go to do certain things, but we just don't go to all work together at the same time anymore.
And if you aren't doing that, you're acting disproportionately because you should be.
Well, yes. I mean, far be it from me, Jeremy, to think that I would take some very small point about whether it was reasonable to get on a train from Manchester to London to see counselling conference, but I might.
Now, you could see a whole range of interesting new arguments opening up, can't you, in that connection? Because clearly there are changes which will be argued about.
Yes, exactly, and what I'm talking about, that's very much the small end of it. I think, but certainly the fact that when you've suddenly got ways of working that are undoubtedly cheaper, and you choose not to, then that seems to me what the standard basis is there for, to sort of set a standard, not so much an not always just an irreducible minimum, but in terms of calibrating what reasonable means, they will be the new arguments, I would imagine.
I think, Andrew, you've already sort of given the game away a bit that fixed costs have not changed for some years, as expected by Lord Dyson when he was Master of the Rolls. Anything on the horizon, though, now that we can expect some that and DBAs? Anything in the sort of law reform areas that we can expect something
not
about?
That I'm aware of. The government did indicate an enthusiasm for extending fixed recoverable costs earlier this year. You remember Lord Justice Jackson's proposals go back to 2017, and nothing happened, I think, until last year. So that they were left on the plate for 2 years when the government consulted on his proposals with a slight variance. So he suggested that a new track, the intermediate track, would be created, say between the fast track and the top of the multi-track, and this would take straightforward claims up to £100,000, and fixed costs would be recoverable in the intermediate track, but costs would remain at large in the reduced multi-track. And the government thought that was probably going to be a bit too, I don't know why, but they thought it was going to be a bit too complicated. So they abandoned the question of a separate track, and they just said, well, the fixed recoverable costs will apply to straightforward cases up to 100,000. That's what they consulted on. But that's, I think their response was due last year, and I don't think we yet have anything since then. So we've had over a year, probably 18 months of nothing happening. So, I mean, well, you know what happens sometimes with the government, they suddenly say, we've dusted this off the shelf and we're now going to go ahead with it. But there's no indication that I'm aware of that's happening at the moment.
And Nick Bacon and Rachel Mulheron's work on DBAs, anything on the horizon there? No.
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
You'll remember there was a big launch of their proposals. If I said it was last year, it was probably the year before, but it was either last year or the year before. I couldn't tell you when. And now I've heard nothing since then. So there's no obvious appetite for it in government, as far as I'm aware.
The one thing we have had is a change in the rules on seeking a variation of a budget. Has that filtered through to the cost office yet, or is that really something that you'll experience a bit further down the line?
I think we'll get it further down the line. I mean, I have to say, I mean, one of the reasons for, or one of the reasons I've used for saying that there is no good reason to depart from the budget is that the receiving party didn't apply for a variation when it could have done. So I'm not too sure that the rules are going to have a great impact. I mean, to some extent, I think it's sort of codifying what is possibly the case anyway.
Is this impacting on you at all, Andy, yet?
Only potentially in cases that I can't talk about because they might be coming before Andrew at some stage. Suffice to say that, you know, I can imagine that lawyers might get busy as to whether it's been toughened up because it now says must apply as opposed to shall apply, and whether there's much of a difference between shall and must, or whether it's just being a bit more modern and plain English to say must. But the twin thing is that yes, you must do it, but you must also do it promptly. So therefore, if you do it, but you do it quite late, one wonders whether that's going to be something that's going to come up. Well, it's going to come up on the variation application itself. You know, that's before we get to whether good reasons are going to be applied. Certainly, I think that there's a slight trick being missed in terms of the there's a form. I know you love forms, Jeremy. There's a new precedent T, which is at least there's a standard form now for presenting a budget variation, but in it you still merge together the incurred and further estimated costs that you expect to expend on the budget phase that you're seeking a variation about. Now, it seems to me a pretty basic question. You know, if I was a judge, would, you know, the first thing I'd be sort of saying was, okay, well, you now say that this phase should be, you know, £100,000 or what have you. You know, how much have you actually spent on it so far? They don't actually have to say that on the form. They can, you know, but if they've, you know, if the last budget was 50 and they've already spent 70, then you would have thought, well, you're a bit late, mate, aren't you? In some respects, potentially.
Yeah.
But that's a minor gripe on my part. But it does seem to suggest to me that the idea of being able to allow some retrospectivity as a pragmatic thing, bringing aspects of sharp and blank into the rules because they weren't there before, is a sensible idea if we're talking about fairly short periods where it's just too bitty to start putting in other little slices of incurred costs. But, you know, I don't think it's intended to be something that you can pack a year's incurred costs into before you've even applied and expect to get home. But we shall see.
It is the old tactical problem, though, isn't it? You know, have we got enough to go now, or are we going to be told we've gone too soon, or do we have to wait? In which case, we're told we've gone too late. It happens in so many areas of the law.
Well, when we give you know, general advice to clients about budgeting, we tend to urge them to always have in mind the assumptions that went into the first budget, because if you keep those under review during your, you know, your case meetings, periodic case reviews, or so and so, it's more likely to jump off the page if something you expected to happen either hasn't happened or has happened on a larger scale than you were expecting or was budgeted for. Because when those costs appear on the ledger, they could well be a lag. And in any event, the costs on the ledger don't tell you by themselves how far through that aspect of the work you are. So, you know, better to go by, you know, there's obviously easy things like, you know, the trial's twice the length it was. I mean, we get all that. Or we were expecting to see, we were expecting to produce 5 witness statements. It looks like we're now going to produce 12. Well, the minute you know that, even before you have, then that's the time to go, it seems to me.
Yeah.
And there we are. That's a bit of my views on budgeting.
Well, I'd like to thank you both for this really interesting conversation. We hope those who are watching and listening have found it helpful. I'm not going to ask either of you to speculate when the population of cost lawyers and cost judges is sufficiently immune to start in-presence hearings all over again, because your lawyers are not medics. But I will, in the meantime, wish everybody a very happy Christmas and keep safe. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
And a happy Christmas.
And to you also.